Hello, and thank you for joining me. Today I'm going to talk about how to give an effective and engaging webinar, but what I really want to talk about is how to give an awesome webinar. And I don't know if I would call myself an expert, but I've been giving webinars since 2016 pretty regularly. It started with once a month so that I could train my teachers with things related to teaching and learning, and it eventually built out so I'd give more and more webinars every month. And now I give about 7 webinars every month at my institution, and I give a few more outside of my institution as well. So I do have some experience, some lessons learned over the years, and I don't want to call myself an expert because just because you do something a lot doesn't mean you do it well. And so I want to be mindful of that, but I also want to share a few of the lessons that I've learned. So let's start talking about slide design. Here are some things that you don't want to do. And this is the same whether you're giving a webinar, a conference presentation, teaching a class, conducting a meeting. You don't want to put too much text on the screen. So I'm going to show some examples from my inbox of PowerPoint presentation slides that I've received over the years. Now I'm just going to cycle through these. I replaced the text with lorem ipsum, but I kept the general content on the screen. So these are real formatted slides that I've received over the years, and you've probably seen a lot of these in your presentations as well. Some of them are colorful, some of them are not, but the thing is when you put too much text on your screen, then it can be distracting, and the reason why is because the parts of your brain that are responsible for listening, for auditory speech, is the same as the parts of the brain for when you're reading text. And so when you put a lot of words on the screen, then your audience either can read the text on the screen or they can listen to you, and they can try and do both, but we can't multitask because we're asking too much of the same part of our brain. Now, if you rely on visual elements, then you can register visual cues and pictures on the slide at the same time that you're listening, and those don't conflict in the brain. So you can do both of those at the same time. That's why you don't want too much text on the screen. Now let's look at this screen here. I have some elements. It's a little bit busy. It does look kind of clean, but right now there's no direction for where your eyes go. I can't really predict or direct what you are looking at. So one thing you can do is you can highlight the parts on the screen that you particularly want people to pay attention to. For example, when I highlight the top part, or the key message part, then I can determine that I want your eyes to go there. And likewise, if I highlight another part of the screen as well. So I still have content on the screen, but I have a little bit more control over where you're looking. Now let's take a look at this graph right here. Ask yourself, is this a good graph? Now, besides the fact that it doesn't have a caption, that the axes aren't labeled, just in terms of it being on a slide, is this a good graph? And you might even ask, is it more good or is it more bad? I think that it's pretty good, but it's also a little bit busy. I have no control over what you're looking at. And there's a lot of information competing for your attention. And so if I were to highlight certain elements of this graph, then I can control. Now on the y-axis, I can determine, okay, I'm going to force you pretty much to look at the value 90% because I've blurred out everything else. On the x-axis, I'm pretty much compelling you to look at group 5, and that converges right at the top right corner of the screen, and that's the value that I want you to look at. I want you to recognize that group 5 has 90% of whatever the variable is. But you can see that I have a lot of information on the screen, but I'm really directing that attention. I really want to force you to look at a certain element. Now, if I were to change that element, now where do your eyes go? Your eyes go to group 3, 40%. And you're looking at the variable that I want you to look at. Let's try one more. So you can see that by isolating these elements, I'm not hiding everything else, but I'm really focusing on certain elements on the screen, and it really directs your attention right there, right where I want it to be. So in short, that first graph is good, but it can be better. My next tip implies that you are perhaps broadcasting from home. So my tip is to turn off your email, turn off your phones, and if you're working from home, turn off your dogs, or children, or spouse, or equivalent. The gist is that you want to get rid of distractions for one, but you also want to get rid of anything that might compete with your presentation. So close down your email client because you don't want pop-ups to appear on the screen. Turn off your phone, and I didn't say put your phone on silent because there's a difference between your phone being on silent and your phone being off. When our phones are on silent, they're not really that silent. They're still making noise when they vibrate. So if you receive a notification on your phone and your phone vibrates on your desk, then people are going to recognize that hum. It's kind of a universal vibration hum noise. And so your audience might think, oh my goodness, I heard that. Whether it's over the speaker or not, they are going to check their phones. They're going to think, did I receive a notification? Was that the person who's giving the presentation? And then they become distracted. And so it's a good practice to just turn the phone off. Off does not mean vibrate. Just turn it off completely, put it in a drawer if you can manage that, if that's within the realm of possibility. Another thing you want to leverage is a clock of some sort. Now, if your phone is off, then you can use Presenter View in PowerPoint, and that has a clock that's very nice. If not, then a watch or an actual physical clock, maybe something on the wall. You just want to make sure that you're set up. Now, something that I will advise against is using long pauses in your presentation. Now, if you're teaching face-to-face presentation, then long dramatic pauses can actually be quite effective. It can allow time for reflection. It can really emphasize a point. But they don't work so well in webinars because attendees might be concerned that they've lost sound or that they have a bad connection. Have you ever been on a meeting or a call and then there's 2 seconds of silence and somebody chimes in saying, I think we lost you, Jennifer. Is it just me? A good practice in a webinar is to pause every once in a while and take questions. Actually have a slide dedicated to pausing the cadence, the rhythm of your presentation, so that you can address any questions. And there might be questions in the chat box or in a questions window, so you can take some time and answer those questions. Now, in a regular presentation, a classroom setting, for example, you can break from your presentation and take questions throughout. People can raise their hand if that's how you teach. But during webinars, you can't always see questions coming in. So it's good to have somebody who can facilitate the questions, and then you can schedule in the breaks so that they can ask you any questions that they weren't able to answer or any questions that would be good to present to the body of the attendees. But if you plan on scheduling the breaks, then the attendees can type out their questions as they occur, and then they don't have to wait too long until they get their answers. And this goes along with another important point that I want to make, which is that you should have a sidekick, because webinars should not be solo affairs. You can have your sidekick ask questions like I just mentioned, but they can also monitor the chat. They can monitor the audio, make sure your screen sharing is good, especially from an attendee point of view. Sometimes you might be having an issue and you have no idea, and so you're just going along, and so it's good to have somebody who can come in and interject and correct the course if needed to. One thing that I teach people often is to fail forward, because you're not going to get it right the first time, and maybe not even the 10th time, and giving webinars is a challenging thing, and it requires finesse, and you're going to make some mistakes. And so it's good to learn from those mistakes, refine your process, and try it again, and you're going to see a lot more successes. And one model that I like to employ is the start, stop, continue model. And so I'll have 3 lists after the webinar is finished, then I can take some time to reflect and jot down some notes. And so one of the things I'll note is, what did I do that didn't really work? What are the errors that I committed? What are the things that I was doing that I should stop doing, that I shouldn't do next time? Likewise, what did I do that worked really well, that I want to make sure that I continue doing in the future? And finally, maybe you have some ideas that you can incorporate into the future, things that you can start. So that's start, stop, and continue. Essentially, you want to document your webinar process and refine it. And the more you give webinars and the more you document and the more you refine, then the more comfortable you'll be in delivering your presentations. Something that I don't consider optional is good audio. So invest in a great microphone. And I'll tell you that there are plenty of microphones out there for less than $100. And if you're curious what this person's screaming there, he's saying, Alexa, what are the 10 best microphones for podcasting? And you're going to find there's all kinds of blog posts out there, all kinds of review sites, and all kinds of microphones for under $100. Microphones are better than they've ever been, and they're cheaper than they've ever been as well. So just know that you don't have to have a professional studio grade musician microphone. There are plenty available for you. And if you like the way that I sound right now, I'm using a Blue Yeti, and it cost me about $129 several years ago. It's held up very well over the years, and I like the quality that it produces. And for the price point, I'm very satisfied with that. Something else that you'll want to do is, before the webinar starts, there's that moment as people are gathering and they're waiting for the webinar to begin. You want to have some kind of landing page for them to look at. And these are a few examples from webinars that I've given over this past year. I like to be a little bit creative. You don't have to be creative, but you want to give them something to look at. It doesn't have to be too fancy. But what you don't want to do is rely on the default landing page, which if you're using Zoom or GoToMeeting or WebEx, it's usually something to the point of a white background and they're saying, we're waiting for the webinar to start. Thank you for joining us, whatever. I like to make mine a little bit more colorful, and there's plenty of free images that you can find online. You can go to Unsplash or Pixabay, and you can find all kinds of imagery that are great. And so just be creative, give them something to look at. A question that I receive all the time is to script or not to script. And I know all you English majors out there, this is not Hamlet that we're looking at, but this is the image that I could find for free. It's probably the Three Musketeers or a reenactment of the Spanish Inquisition skit by Monty Python. But the gist is, do we script out our webinars or should we not script the webinars? And I don't have a definitive answer for you. I'm definitely not opposed to writing a script. I don't think that the script should be read unless you're a trained actor or a voiceover person, but it could be a good thing to have. There are some points that I want to emphasize though. So definitely you should write a detailed outline and you should rehearse it. You should practice, rehearse, you should know exactly where you're going to go. You should timestamp it approximately. Perhaps you could write a script. I'm not going to say you shouldn't. I'm not going to say you should. Once you have that detailed outline, you can go ahead and write the script, but don't be afraid to go off the script. Again, the key is practice and rehearsal. What you don't want to do is wing it. People know if you're winging a presentation. Even if you've done it a lot, that doesn't mean you do it well. And you also don't want to sound like a robot. And I think especially if you're in academia or training and development, then you might not be trained to read a script. And so you might sound a little bit robotic, and you want to humanize your presence as much as possible. And you also want to avoid using fillers, which is why a good outline and rehearsal and maybe even a script would be good because it keeps you on track. You don't go on tangents and you don't use fillers in your speech. Another point to make is that words kill people. Hashtag death by PowerPoint. And I don't mean literally. I want to specify that words and text on a slide can bring people to boredom, a state of ennui that is unsettling. And even if the words don't kill people per se, it definitely can kill motivation, enthusiasm, and attention. So it may be tempting to laden your slides with bullet points, narrative, entire paragraphs, and quotes. In reality, those things should be off screen, and you should use imagery, visualization, in order to communicate, to supplement your text. If you have a slide deck with all kinds of slides, with all kinds of narrative, that's great. Print that out, give it to your audience, email it to them, provide that as a handout, and then go back to the drawing board and use imagery for your presentation as opposed to narrative, because you don't want the narrative on the screen to compete with what you're saying. People can either listen to you or they can read your slide, and you definitely don't want them to do the latter. So to illustrate this, I actually pulled a few slides from presentations that I've done this last year, and so I want to break from the cadence of this webinar, which is how to teach effective webinar skills, and I want to jump into the role of these past webinars that I've been giving in the context that they were given. And I'm going to skip around a little bit, but I'll show you how I use imagery in my slides as opposed to a lot of text. So here we go. This first set of slides is from a webinar that I gave early on in 2020 as the pandemic was taking off and people had to start teaching online even if they weren't experienced with that. I gave a webinar on how to teach effectively online. So you are all wonderful, your students are great, and I'm sure they get all A's. I'm sure that all of your students are just straight A students, and I'm here to say that's wonderful, but I'm going to give you a few B's. Now the B's that I'm going to give you are to be human, to be present, and to be adaptable. And we're going to talk about what each of these things mean in an online class. But you know what? Bruce Lee also has a B to give to you. His B is to be like water. Bruce Lee says to be formless, shapeless like water. If you put water in a cup, it becomes a cup. If you put it in a teapot, it becomes a teapot. Now water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friends. And so I want to reiterate what Bruce Lee told us, in that I want us to be flexible in our mind. Don't restrict students' creativity, freedom, and growth. And scene. Another webinar that I gave was around technology, educational technology in the classroom. Here's what those slides look like. So now I want to talk a little bit about what is educational technology. Also, what isn't educational technology? So when you think of ed tech, you probably think of devices, maybe production studios, perhaps even gadgets and artificial intelligence, etc. But I want to talk about one thing that technology isn't, And educational technology is never going to be the solution to problems in education. And the reason why is because technology is not a learning theory. Whatever the problem is, the solution, the answer is probably that we need teacher-student connection, or we need student-student connection. Technology can help us achieve that, but again, it is not a learning model in itself. Now, if you look at this slide here, there was a time when the use of a chalkboard was a topic that was hotly debated in education. The question is it a good idea to turn one's back on learners so that you can write on a board? And well, today that debate seems quite quaint. The blackboard or whiteboard or smartboard has faded into the background. It's part of the educational landscape now. And that's the true goal of good ed tech, is to fade into the background of a learning environment. It should enhance teaching and learning, but get out of the way while it's doing that. Or as Fred Rogers told us, it's not about technology, it's about relationships. And scene. You can see that I used a few words, but I also used imagery to help tell the story and communicate my ideas. In my slides, I relied a lot more on imagery than I relied on the words. Now I want to change gears and showcase a presentation that I did that was more on designing content and designing PowerPoint slides for teachers. So we're going to start out and talk about contrast, the designer's best friend. So the principle of contrast is all about accentuating differences. We're actually conditioned to notice differences and appreciate contrast. In literature and in films, we find struggles between contrasting characters to be particularly compelling. Think about Darth Vader versus Luke Skywalker, or Harry Potter versus the Dark Lord Voldemort. We may not be conscious about it, but we are always searching for differences in our environment. Whether it's an African grassland and we're scanning the horizon looking for something that looks out of place and determining, is that a danger to me? Or if you're on a tundra of all white and you're looking for something that stands out. Now in the classroom, I don't think we're looking for danger. I sure hope that our students aren't looking for danger, but that primal urge for us to look for contrast still exists, so we can leverage that and really emphasize certain points in our presentations. Now here I have a dark text on a light background. You can also have light text on top of a dark background. But if you want background images, then those images that we choose are exceedingly important, and we want to avoid noisy or gradient backgrounds, or graphics that morph and blend from dark to light shades. And if you do something a little bit colorful, a little bit noisy, then like I did right here, I put a box over it. It's a little bit transparent so you can see what's happening in the background, but the words can pop up on the screen as I have my visual elements there. Now here's an example of a slide that is not that great. Yes, it has enough contrast. It's dark font on a light background, but the background is so busy that it's actually very hard to read the text. And the harder it is to read, then the fewer words people are going to read, and you're going to start losing your audience. And worst case scenario, you'll give them headaches because there's so much visual competition going on and it strains their eyes and their brains. Now here's that same title on a dark background, and you can see that the gradient is good. This background is actually a very good background for a slide, except for there's not enough contrast, so I'd want to make that font light on a dark background. Now you can have busy backgrounds, but you want to be strategic about how you use them. Here are a few examples. In this case, I have my slide split 50-50. The text isn't competing with a busy background, and I've cropped the image to fit into the slot there. And I can swap out those images as well. If I like various landscapes, you can even play around with the content and the positioning on the screen, but my point is that I have a busy image there, it's off to the side, it's not competing with the text on the screen, and there's also not too much text, and so everything kind of plays its part. So always remember, light text on a dark background and dark text on a light background. And scene. These are 3 examples of presentations that I've done in the past and how I relied more on visual imagery for my slides than I did for narrative and written text. Now there's something, if we're talking about PowerPoint, there's something that your audience should never ever see, and that is this slide right here. End of slideshow. Click to exit. This shows up when you've completed all of your slides and you keep advancing and there's no more slides to advance to. PowerPoint says, well, we're done, and you never want your audience to see this. Instead, create a final slide, something purposeful that you can end on, something professional. And so it could look like the question marks that I put earlier in this presentation. You can find some free stock photography and some word art if you want to have a question slide, or you can find other imagery. Sometimes when I'm giving presentations, I do something fun like this. Say, congratulations, you made it through the presentation, you made it through the webinar, you made it through class. If this was a conference presentation, then maybe I'd put some of my contact information on their screen there, maybe a QR code or social media link. But this slide serves two purposes. For one, it cues to me that, oh, that's my last slide. I know that that's my last slide. We're done with the presentation. So let me wrap up. Let me say my final thoughts. Let me address the questions from the audience. And it also serves the purpose that for the audience, it gives them something very professional that they can end on. It makes you look good, and it's just a good way to wrap up your webinar. So I really appreciate you joining me. If you have other tips, tricks, pointers, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I would love to hear your ideas, your thoughts, and any strategies that you use. It'd be great to have a good discussion down there in that comment section. And as always, visit us on social media, subscribe to this channel, read through some of our blog posts on our website, howtocanvas.com. And it's really important that I say this last thing to you, and that is happy teaching and learning.